A well-known story is the tale of the emperor's new clothes, about two con artists who come to a kingdom who claim to be experts in fabric and fine clothing. And they're going to make the emperor a new set of clothes with a special fabric that can only be seen by people who are suited to their position. In other words, if you can't see it, you are not suited to your position. So naturally, when people examine the fabric, including the emperor, no one wants to acknowledge that they can't see the fabric. And in the end, when the emperor displays his clothes with much pageantry and pomp, the entire kingdom is in awe of the splendor of these clothes until a young child finally points out, but he's not wearing anything. By which time the con artists, passing as tailors, have made off with their ill-gotten gains, and the people of the kingdom are the wiser for the experience. Many people often like to look at the emperor metaphorically, and in our world today they'll say, who is that proverbial emperor who is wearing nothing? But in many ways, this story is not about the emperor. It's not about the fact that he is not wearing any clothes. It's about the entire kingdom of people in which no one believed he was wearing clothes. But each person believed everyone else believed he was wearing clothes, and no one wanted to be that lone voice to challenge or question the integrity of these con artists who had set up everything by their own terms. Because if you question us, you are not suited to your position. And the result was an entire population of people who were just too afraid to challenge something that was blatantly obvious to everyone. I remember a few years back, when Pope Benedict visited the United States. One event was a meeting he had with the U.S. bishops in the crypt portion of the Basilica to Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., the crypt chapel underneath the basilica. And part of the meeting was him receiving three questions from three different bishops, one question each, one of whom was among the oldest of the bishops in the United States. And he stepped forward, and before he asked this question, referring, of course, to a long-term relationship he's had with Pope Benedict, even when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, before asking his question of the Holy Father, he says, "You and I, Holy Father, have had many disagreements over the years, haven't we?" To which, with equal joviality, Pope Benedict said, "Yes, we've had some lively discussions in the past." Well, the very next day, in the parish in which I was serving, two people came up to me at different times thinking, how dare that bishop speak like that to the Holy Father? Who does he think he is? What is our church coming to? How could he even challenge the Holy Father or even hint at a challenge, either in the present or in the past? And yet they forget that that has been the dynamic of the church throughout history. Jesus did not establish the church on the benevolent dictatorship of Peter, but under the unifying leadership of Peter, of an entire college of apostles succeeded by the bishops. And there was that dynamic of multiple different personalities leading this church. We see an example of that in the gospel today, in which Jesus himself is giving very eloquently a teaching. And I find it ironic because, of course, today we celebrate Mother's Day throughout our country. And yet today's gospel, we hear repeatedly, "My Father, my Father, my Father, my Father, my Father." But in the midst of this, Jesus is giving assurances. I'm going to prepare a place for you, and I will come back to take you with me. And in the midst of this, two of the apostles almost interrupt him midway to ask a question and raise an issue. And one of those two apostles is one we always like to label as the doubter, Thomas, along with Philip. It's even clear at a certain point in today's gospel that Jesus is a bit annoyed with the questions, in particular the question of Philip, because he says, have I been with you for so long a time, and you still do not know me, Philip? How can you say, show us the Father? So in other words, Jesus is a little annoyed at Philip's question. But you notice at no time does Jesus forbid them from asking the question, which is a far cry from what we see in the Old Testament with some of the dynamic between God and the people he associates with. And two of my favorite examples in that are of Abraham and Job. In the case of Abraham, God says to him, "Look up at the stars of the sky, count them if you can, and so numerous will I make your descendants. And this land on which you stand, I will give to your descendants." Well, Abraham asks the question. He says, "Lord, how am I to know that this is to happen?" Whereupon, after an elaborate ceremony of sacrifice in which God formally enters into covenant with Abraham, God answers Abraham's questions, "How am I to know?" And in a nutshell, the answer is basically, because I'm God, and I have told you it's going to happen. Asking for something that is commonplace for us, or at least what we are asked of, what is asked of us, but was radical at the time of Abraham, and that is to have faith in the divinity who is entering into a relationship with him. In the story of Job, we hopefully know that story, in which Job is deprived of his wealth and his health and his family. And at a certain point, in pondering why this happened, he actually challenges God in so many words. "I dare you, Lord, tell me what I must have done to deserve this. Make me understand why this happened." And very elaborately, out of a storm, at the very end of the book, God answers Job's question, and in so many words, basically says, "I don't require you to understand why this happened. All you need to understand is that I understand why this happened." And in the end, Job submits in faith. But these are the early stages of God's relationship with his people. Very much similar to when we were children, we would ask our parents why, and sometimes they would simply say, "Because I'm your mother, because I'm your father, and I have said so." But as we get older and our relationship with our parents grows and matures, we don't hear that as much. And the same was with God's relationship with his people. From the very beginning, when he had his relationship and entered into his covenant with Abraham, he was forming his people to eventually be the nation out of which the Messiah would emerge. And as he's with his apostles, at no point does Jesus forbid the question. And while he still at some time says we must just have faith, as he says in today's gospel, "You have faith in God, have faith also in me," there are other times in which Jesus does, in fact, answer their question, even from an apostle who we like to label as a doubter. If Thomas hadn't asked the question, "How can we know the way?" we would not have had the answer, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." If Philip had not brought up the rather annoying question to Jesus, "Show us the Father," we would not have had Jesus say, "The Father and I are one. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father." And so in many ways, the doubt or the questions that we ask lead to answers that hopefully deepen our faith and strengthen our resolve as people of faith. But at no time does Jesus forbid that. And we see that dynamic over and over again in the history of the church and even in the scriptural portrayals of the early decades of the church. I often like to point out in the presentation that each evangelist makes and how they present Jesus and his relationship with his disciples, I always like to point out that Jesus called Peter to task, or they remembered that Jesus called Peter to task, probably because the apostles were doing it on a regular basis in the early decades of the church. Here's the first unifying leader of the church still being challenged and even called to task at times by Jesus. But St. Paul himself, in the letter to the Galatians, tells of a time when he publicly challenged Peter. When he says in the letter to the Galatians, "I went up to Antioch and I opposed Cephas," Peter, "to his face because he was wrong." It's a dynamic that has always existed in the church. And in fact, the church has been at its weakest and its credibility at its weakest when it has had leaders who would tolerate no question whatsoever and that their authority is absolute because of the position that they have or the expertise that they claim to hold. The church has always been at its weakest and its credibility at its weakest when they've had that, but it's been at its strongest when you have the dynamic of leaders, bishops, priests, theologians debating and talking and challenging each other, because in that questions are raised which lead to answers that lead to a strengthening of the resolve of our faith and a deepening of our understanding of it. And that we are not a people who are called to always blindly accept everything that's given to us, but we as thinking, rational human beings made in God's image and likeness can ask questions. But even then, we run into people whose approach to faith is, I don't question anything. Sometimes even confessing as a sin that they doubt their faith. But doubts lead to questions. Questions lead to answers. And the right answers lead to a deepening of faith. And while yes, at times we are called to have that faith that we put in God, who's not going to give us all the answers, we are not, however, called to never challenge, to never question. In fact, we see much of that in our world today and all throughout history. How often have tyrants and tyrannical governments been based on the fact that you never question and never challenge the tyrant or the tyrannical regime? We see people often falling into that or being tempted into falling into that, even down to today. Leaders who will often say before a press conference or before people who want to challenge them, I will not answer that question. I will not deal with that issue. And yet we also see leaders who have no problem and no hesitation in putting themselves out there and being regularly challenged by their opponents, by the press, questioned, debated, and challenged, and coming out stronger as leaders with a stronger credibility for their people. We see it in reporters, some of whom say, not only will I report it, but I will tell you what to think about it, and you must think this and not think any differently. And then reporters who report what is going on in the world, what is going on in our communities and our nation. And we decide what to think and how to process it. We even see some networks with the motto, we report, you decide. And I recall a scene in the movie Citizen Kane in which the media tycoon Charles Foster Kane says very boldly, people will think what I tell them to think. And it's a story of the downfall of a man. We even see it in people we put our faith in as experts. We hear such phrases as the science-based. What do the scientists say? What does the science tell us? And sometimes we put down people who will question the science, forgetting that science is based at its heart on questions, expanding, experimenting, and always growing, always asking questions. But then there are those who say science is absolute, it must never be questioned. We see it in the whole dynamic of global warming or global cooling or global climate change. I forget what they call it now. But there are those who are absolute in their assertions, and there are those who question from their own data and conclusions whether the conventional wisdom shouldn't be challenged or questioned. And oftentimes one side wants to silence the other because they will tolerate no question, no challenge. Even in the midst of what our nation and our world continues to endure during this coronavirus pandemic, we put a great deal of faith in the experts, in the scientists, and here's how our leaders have said we must respond to it. And then there are those on the other side who have drawn different conclusions or ask questions or bring forth new challenges based on their own data as doctors dealing with this pandemic. And on the one hand, they want to throw in their feedback and their input in the debate, in the question, and on the other hand, some would have them silenced or censored or taken off the air or ignored because it is not in line with the conventional wisdom or with an agenda that someone has adhered to. But as a people of faith, we have that example in the gospel. Not even Jesus prohibited the asking of questions, even the questions that he found annoying. And just this last week, Catholic historian John Rao made the point of distinguishing the practice of never asking questions or refusing to take them and the credibility it lends to the authority or the expert who is speaking, in which he states in the article he posted last week, our Socratic forebears taught us that the reasoning man does not have to be an expert in a given field to be able to make a competent judgment regarding whether he is dealing with leaders whose advice he should heed or reject as fraudulent. Frauds demand absolute faith in their claims, treating the confused doubter with contempt for his invincible ignorance. Such impostors may seriously believe that they are omniscient experts. But when they tell the young or otherwise healthy persons that they are in the same condition as the weakest of the elderly or the already ill, when they say that in order to protect itself, the vast mass of the population has to abandon its livelihood, the well-being of its country, the cultural life of its civilization, and the tools required for its eternal salvation, they must be dismissed for what they actually are: quacks. Frauds demand that we never question their expertise or their word. But not even Jesus forbade that. We see in Thomas and in Philip, in the apostles, in the theologians throughout our church's history, the asking of questions, the challenging of authority. It doesn't lead to a lack of credibility, but strengthens and deepens the substance of our faith and the resolve that we have as people of faith. The church is at its best when it's allowed its leaders to question itself and the people to question them. Our civilization is at its strongest when the population, as we see even today during this crisis, challenge the leaders, ask the questions, bring up the issues. But we see everything at its weakest when someone demands no questions whatsoever. So let us see the apostles in today's gospel as examples for all of us, as people in a society, and especially as people of faith. Let us not be afraid to raise questions, even if those questions are based on doubt. Because doubt leads to those questions. Questions lead to answers, and answers lead to a deepening of faith and a greater resolve for us as a society, as a nation, as a church, and a greater resolve to the faith we profess as a people of that faith in Jesus Christ.